Dr. G, good morning. Thanks for joining me again on the show.
Good morning, Alex. Thanks for having me again.
All right, so a few things I want to touch on with you, but the first one that jumped out at me was General Mattis telling Pakistan that it's time to end the Afghanistan war, but I took that as a broader note that it is time to end the Afghanistan war. We've been in it's one of our longest prolonged conflicts overseas for a long time, I want to get your thoughts overall on the state of play out there in Afghanistan, if you agree with General Mattis on this, if you were surprised to hear him speak this plainly about it. Give me your thoughts.
Yeah, I mean, it is officially the longest war we have ever been in. Remember, it started in October of 2001, so that makes it longer than Vietnam, Korea, World War II, or any other conflict we've been engaged in. I'm not surprised because this is what I saw from the president in the White House. Whenever there was a meeting on Afghanistan, he'd always ask the most trenchant questions about why we are there, especially when H.R. McMaster was constantly trying to double down and actually increase our footprint in Afghanistan.
Yeah.
I remember explicitly there was one moment where he was reading a slide deck and hit the say I can't go into the details, but in the opening sentence for every slide that HR had written had the same sentence, and he just leafed through the whole thing. And then he stopped and he said, this sentence at the top of the slide, the federal government of Afghanistan will. And he just said, what federal government of Afghanistan? I mean, this is who he is. He's the common sense, a businessman who just applies reality to fantasies of the elite, especially the national security elite. And he understands from that common sense perspective, there's only one reason alone why we deployed to Afghanistan in the winter of 01. And it's the same reason today. Nothing has changed. The only reason Afghanistan matters is that the territory of that country should never again be used by anybody to launch mass casualty attacks on the territory of the United States. Period. End of story. And that mission can be accomplished with much, much smaller military commitment by us. And the idea that it's ever going to become a functioning federal nation is, of course, absolute fantasy. And I'm very, very happy to hear Secretary Mattis echo the president's sentiments.
Yeah, this is interesting here because by the way, this is like the third time today on the show where we have a blast from the past. I'm really glad you reminded me of H.R. McMasters' plan to drastically increase troops in Afghanistan. And I remember, and I think it was only just over a year ago, but I remember that at Breitbart we were engaged pretty heavily in seemed like a negotiation to keep the troop increase in Afghanistan to a minimum. Like literally, even though the president campaigned on getting us out of Afghanistan, and I believe genuinely he wants to get us out of Afghanistan. He was surrounded by so many generals that wanted to add. We were literally debating whether or not he'd add a few thousand troops or tens of thousands of troops. It was totally surreal, and I'm glad that finally it seems like we're on course.
Yeah, look, I'm as former national security editor for Breitbart, of course I'm biased, but I have to say what Francis Martel, what Edwin Moore, what all of the team has done is incredibly important because I think it's probably the only voice out there. I don't count the libertarians who really are didactic, who are ideological, who don't actually analyze the situation. It's always just, pull out, pull out, pull out. No, it was Breitbart that was constantly beating the drum and saying, the MAGA agenda requires being smart about how we do national defense, and it's had an effect. And, the president is, at times, we know on Jerusalem, he only had 3 members of the cabinet support him on the decision to move the embassy and recognize Jerusalem, and that's really stunning. So, the president is, many, many occasions, a lone voice who's sticking to his guns, sticking to the reason why we elected him. And that's why it's important for, the listeners, for Breitbart to give that support from the outside that allows him to achieve the mission that we elected him to actually implement.
Yeah, this is a remarkable thing about revolution that's taking place on the right now, Dr. Gorka, that you and I are obviously intimately a part of, which is even though I think you would agree with me that you're a fan of the peace through strength approach, that we got to be intimidating, we got to be willing to be unpredictable, to use force when necessary, maybe test drive some of the equipment every so often to remind people we're not afraid. But overall, it is much more about trying to have a much more tighter, thoughtful national security that does not involve us in these prolonged nation-building efforts overseas where you do expel so much blood and treasure. And this is one where we still have work to do. You know, you and I do, and those who are with us here in the trenches on the right.
Well, look, there's actually, this is the only reason that, 3 years ago, oh my gosh, it seems like much longer, 3 or 4 years ago, I agreed to come over to Breitbart when asked, because at the time I saw this incredibly pathetic reality on the right in conservative politics in general. If you had a stance on national security, you were doomed to only be given two options. Either you had to be, a ridiculous fantasist neoconservative who thought that you could invade other people's countries and at the end of the gun barrel turn them into democracies, or you had to be, a Randista. You had to be a total isolationist.
Yes.
You could pull down you could pull down the shutters on the Pacific and Atlantic coast and everything would be fine. And I thought, that's nuts. That's just crazy. National security is a little bit more nuanced than that, and there's got to be a happy medium between the two. And I think you just described it. The president's approach is very simple. We don't get involved everywhere in the world. We're not about changing other people's civilizations. But if you threaten us, we will crush you. And that's the happy medium.
It is important that I note, though, when you look at what are the options that are on the table in Afghanistan, it does seem like the president's policy is mostly about supporting or at least legitimizing the Taliban, as choosing them as the lesser of potential evils. And that is a curious thing. And I understand why that's unsettling to people. Dr. G, do you have any nuance you could put on that for me?
Yeah, just one very specific one. That you have to go a little bit deeper than just saying the Taliban. Because when you say the word Taliban, there are, a couple dozen different actors that count as the Taliban. Sure. The issue here is working with those people who have, and they're out there. They are predominant. Those fundamentalists who have absolutely no ambition that goes beyond the borders of Afghanistan. If they just want to, lord it over a certain district, a certain part of Afghanistan, if they can make sure that people like Al-Qaeda or ISIS aren't training on their territory, those are people we can work with. That's what Petraeus called the reconcilables in Iraq. The issue is you can't conflate those with others who call themselves the Taliban, who are right now, as we speak, working with ISIS, helping them establish training facilities. It's be very precise with who you're talking about. The president is talking, or the administration is referring to the former, not the latter.
This super important point, and I'm glad you got a chance to make it. A former national security editor for Breitbart News and former deputy assistant to the president, Dr. Sebastian Gorka, joins me this week every time, or just about every week at this time. Dr. G, let's change gears slightly. I want to get an update on the Khashoggi situation. The biggest headline yesterday, in my opinion, was that Sean Penn is making a Khashoggi movie. And my first thought was it would be great if I want him to call it Saint Khashoggi. That's what I'm hoping. And we were hoping it would be a claymation, like a claymation of Khashoggi.
Wow.
We were brainstorming. Yeah, perhaps like a Tim Burton
stop motion
presents. Yeah, stop motion.
Harryhausen, right? Yeah.
Perfect. Just in time for the holidays. Saint Khashoggi by a Tim Burton production. That's how we would like to do it. But apparently, it's just a documentary. But what is he going to get there? I mean, what is it in this story?
Well, I'm sure it will start with the moment that he joins the Muslim Brotherhood, and I'm sure it'll go back to his childhood as he was palling around with Osama bin Laden in high school. I'm sure that's where Sean Penn will start. Yeah, I every day I have to remind myself that sadly is I don't know how big it is, but there's a sizable part of this nation that lives in an alternate universe. I was on C-SPAN on Sunday morning, and there, they asked me about this district in Washington that wishes to rename a street. I believe it's the one outside the Saudi embassy, wishes to rename a street after Khashoggi.
Right.
And and hang on a second. What next? Is it going to be Bin Laden Boulevard? Is it going to be KSM Avenue? This guy was murdered, and that's wrong, and that's true, but many things can be true at the same time. And the other thing is, this guy was an unabashed apologist for the Muslim Brotherhood. I had the opinion page editor of the Washington Post say that everything I said on C-SPAN was a lie. And when I challenged her on Twitter, I said, okay, give me 3 of the lies. She couldn't do it. There is no connection for these people. Alex, they're just not connected to reality. Just because he works for the Washington Post, so what? Who cares? I mean, this is an irrelevance. We have Walter Duranty worked for the New York Times. He was the largest apologist for modern dictatorship that we have ever seen in the United States, who literally wrote pieces saying, "Gulags, what gulags?" So, yeah, it just tells you that
and Dr. G, Dr. G, why I'm mocking it is not that I think that it isn't an outrage and a scandal that Khashoggi was murdered, because it's all of those things. But and you agree, and you have on the show, as we've discussed it multiple times. But the focus on this one issue is clearly not about the integrity of the life of Khashoggi, who had a mixed history. He was not he was naturalized towards the very end of his life in America. Was not was he even a citizen, Dr. G?
No,
he certainly
no.
He was not an American citizen. Okay.
He wasn't even a green card holder.
Sure, and he was connected to the. It wasn't even a green card holder. He's connected to the Bin Laden family. He's connected to the Muslim. He's a Muslim Brotherhood supporter, a member. And this is sort of thing where there's been 20 journalists, or at least 18 journalists, that have been murdered in Mexico this year. And you couldn't name one of their names. You don't know one of their names. And I'm not saying that 2 wrongs make a right. Of course they don't. I'm trying to get to the point here where I'm going to note that the media. This is about the media trying to undermine the president's foreign policy. Yes. With relation to Saudi Arabia, and that's the plan here. And has that been successful at this rate, Dr. G, at this point?
No, because the president enjoys this kind of conflict. It's fuel to him, and to your point, when is Sean Penn going to do a documentary about, I don't know, female genital mutilation in Saudi Arabia? Well, when is he going to do a documentary about the women who are beaten up every day because their hijab has slipped in Saudi Arabia or elsewhere? That would show a certain integrity, and that would show that this isn't about a political agenda. You're absolutely correct. This is about they found a new cudgel to beat the president with. But I think, I don't know. Let's ask the callers. Do Americans care? Do they want to go to see a documentary about Khashoggi? I think it would be another massive flop, as we've seen again and again and again.
All right. So, Dr. Gorka, I want to play this clip we've got here of Marco Rubio on CNN. Can we play this, please? 8A, Mr. Paul.
I do think there needs to be some public actions taken as a result of this. Things cannot continue the way they are. And I think I detailed last week on a floor speech very specific asks and things that we should be asking for. And it ranges from human rights issues such as freeing those women women that have been taken prisoner for political reasons, freeing Raif Badawi, who's been jailed, again, for speaking out about the authoritarian nature of the Saudi regime. And then I think going beyond it, I think there are other things that we should consider. The 1, 2, 3 agreements should be postponed on nuclear energy and enrichment and the like. There are all sorts of things that we can do to make clear that this can't continue to happen. Otherwise, he's going to continue to get more reckless and continue to push more boundaries. He's going to frankly pull us into a war one day with some recklessness.
Dr. G, I'm tempted just to mock Marco Rubio or President Rubio on CNN now, but again, I'm not as expert in this as he is or as you are. So let me just get your serious analysis here. Is what Rubio warns about with our increasing ties to MBS in Mohammed bin Salman, does that risk us going into war because he's reckless? Is that true? Do you accept that?
It's laughable. It's utterly laughable. I mean, what war is he going to pull us into? We already have Iran trying to spread its influence all the way across Iraq down south towards the Bekaa Valley. This president will never go neocon, despite what Rubio. He just blows so hot and cold. Sometimes he knows what he's talking about, and then he wants to be, the ghost of John McCain seizes him, and he just gets out of his lane. I mean, you're not the commander-in-chief. You're not the executive. What we have achieved as a nation in the last 2 years is absolutely stunning. Think about this. As a result of the Riyadh speech, we have the GCC turn its back, the Gulf Cooperation Council turn its back on the worst offender in the region, Qatar, the primary funder of the Muslim Brotherhood and jihadi extremism. We have Prince Mohammed bin Salman, literally the acting head of state, give an interview in the Atlantic here in America in which he says, this is the Saudi Crown Prince. He says, Israel has a right to exist. So you want to endanger all of this, Senator Rubio? Please stick to what you know. Stick to what he's good at, which is dealing with the dictatorship in Cuba, representing his own constituents. But don't endanger the complete 180 geopolitical shift that this administration has managed to achieve in the Middle East, which is bringing stability, not the opposite. If we overplay our hand now, as a result of this one foreign national killed on foreign soil. This isn't Benghazi. This isn't Americans killed in Libya. This is a foreign national killed by foreign nationals on foreign soil. If we make that event the catalyst for undermining everything that has been achieved in the last 2 years, that's when you risk conflict, Senator Rubio.
Yeah, this is why we have Dr. Gorka on when he's at his best, providing some clarity here. And it just is so striking how immature the way the media deals with these stories, how they just want this extreme take on it, this extreme overreaction to something that is significant. There should be punishments or changes in policy, all that stuff. But to have this over the top, we need to now we're going to get pulled into war over this stuff. It's just so extreme, the rhetoric. I'm not saying nothing should be done, but it's just so exaggerated. They have so little credibility and, as I said, maturity, the way the left and really the Republican establishment too deals with this stuff. Okay, Dr. G, we've got 3-4 minutes left together, and I want to talk to you about the life and legacy of George H.W. Bush and his foreign policy. And yesterday was a really classy affair, which was great, much better than the McCain funeral. Even George W. Bush, who I've become less and less a fan of as years go on, gave a great eulogy. But I do want to talk a little bit soberly about the legacy of HW. And a lot of it is sort of the start of this era of globalism. And I think we'd be remiss if we didn't discuss that a bit.
Yeah, but what I have to say may surprise you. So I wasn't a huge fan of this individual. It was hard to be, given who preceded him, because being the president after Ronald Reagan.
Yes, tough act to follow, as they say.
Yeah, probably an impossible act to follow. But as I said, I was hosting Dennis Prager's show yesterday, and I openly admit I've changed my opinion on this man just a few weeks before he died, and I'll tell you why. Two things. Number one, I met a former Marine who was a station chief in the CIA, who had a gala event for the Marines, shared his experience of working for Director Bush at the CIA. And you can't go into details, but this was the most forward-leaning CIA director since maybe Wild Bill Donovan and Bill Casey. He did things that we may never know, we may not fully have recounted in the history books ever or for a long time, that were amazingly daring and that protected Americans around the world. So it's a life of service from the youngest combat aviator in the Navy to director of the CIA to vice president to the president. I don't buy this he's the grandfather of globalism stuff. And I'm going to put one more thing on the table. He shepherded, he midwifed the fall of the Soviet Union in a way that really could have been much worse. On Christmas Day, 1991, best Christmas present I ever got, when the Soviet Union dissolved itself, it could have gone a lot differently. Let's remember the coup against Gorbachev, the tanks rolling up outside Parliament, except for the few who were killed, who were murdered in the Baltic states and Romania. The peaceful transition to post-Soviet reality on the Eurasian continent was a massive geopolitical success. And George Bush is owed a lot of the credit for that.
So then how did we get to the point from George H.W. Bush, and Dr. G, I'm glad the happy talk is okay here because I have been overwhelmingly positive about him and his legacy over this week. I think people who listen to the broadcast, though I did note a couple of mistakes and pitfalls that he fell into along the way. So I'm certainly happy to say kind things about the man. But where did we go? How did we get from his foreign policy, which was sort of Reagan light, and then end up where we were in the George W. Bush years, where we were basically had a bomb everything policy?
I think it's very easy. I think there was a diabolical marriage between the former Trotskyites. And let's remember, the neocons started their life as Trotskyites. This is massively important. They say they were mugged by reality, but their impulse always remained this utopian garbage. They only went from being socialist to calling themselves conservatives and changing the world at the end of the gun barrel. So the former Trotskyite, conservatives got in bed with the financial interests, the Wall Streeters who wanted to see more unrepresentative government and control by big business. And that's how we end up with Bush 43. So I think it's the confluence of these two interest groups that undermine classical paleoconservative politics and foreign policy. And that's how we get, the Second Gulf War, the massive footprint in Afghanistan. And that's how we get, the Democrat Party becoming one of the most interventionist parties in the most interventionist groups in American history as well.
Dr. Sebastian Gorka, great analysis. That's why we call on you, my friend. You can pick up the book, Why We Fight, Defeating America's Enemies with No Apologies Now. Thanks, Dr. G.